Good to see you.
Good morning. How's everybody doing?
Good. Good. We're just having a little, we're trying to figure out what is going on with John's version of the vault, because he's seeing all of the stuff, all of the appropriate stuff in the file viewer on the left, in the left-hand column, but he's not seeing any content when he tries to open one of the files.
That was a good idea, but yeah, they're empty too.
Ah. Well, that is.
Oh, wait. So when I open it up in, what did I open it up in? IA Writer, now I see the content.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. That is interesting. I think probably, well, I guess one thing, I mean, do you have another machine which you have, on which you might be able to try to open the vault in Obsidian and see if this is something that, something may have gone wrong with something on this machine that you're trying to do this on, which you're talking to us.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. So I actually, while you're doing that, John, one of the things that I noticed, I have not been, like I said, I drove 6 hours on Thursday to the southern part of the state, and then 6 hours back yesterday. So I have not had as much time to kind of put into making notes and putting them in the vault. There are some things that struck me, and I have, and I've written some notes about this week's reading, especially about this week's extended mind chapters. But I guess another observation that I have, when I went into the vault, there is not as much going on in the vault right now as we have seen, as there has been in previous weeks, and especially in previous clubs. So what do we make of that? I mean, what should we slow down? Should we, kind of take a break? Should we say, well, this is a bad, this is a bad time in everybody's schedule, and and we'll just take longer? Or is this, are we finding this not as much fun and as interesting as we had hoped it would be?
I did actually add some notes to the vault this week. I was a little bit worried because I seem to be there weren't that many other notes added, so I can't really say. But for me, it's okay.
Okay. I noticed you did lose, and actually, I've got my thing open to Dormzilla. I thought that was. I keep coming back. To that. It's almost like it's a crazy thing.
Yeah. So it was about like this embodied cognition, this human-centered design versus system-centered design, and I think Dormzilla is a good example of something that's designed according to a system and not for people at all. So that speaks to the extended mind book.
Yeah.
I think it's a good example of how an example taken to the extreme. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what is he preparing people for? The trip to Mars on, stay in your room in the dark. It did look like a battery farm.
I mean, I think that's what it is, right? So normally university or college is supposed to prepare the student for further studying and future work. And I think this building is for the university to fulfill its requirements for places for people to sleep. and for heads for people to charge. So it's not the focus isn't on the education and the development of the student, but the money flow of the education foundation or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
it's very much,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it would be one thing if this were just, simply a place. Yes, this is where the bunk beds are. You go there and sleep, but you have other, spaces. You have other places to, to study and to, and to be with people and all of that. And, but it doesn't strike me that something that they would build that would look like this would be part of that. That it's probably the, kind of the factory mentality, right?
yeah, like a factory farm almost.
Yeah. 4,500 students. Yeah. I lived in when I went to the University of Massachusetts, I lived in a dorm complex that had a bunch of high rises in it. And the whole dorm complex housed about 5,000 students probably. But there were some low rises, there were some high rises. There were a lot of windows. All rooms had windows. It was kind of weird for me, as you would go up. Some of the high rises were co-ed and some were single sex. As you went up into higher and higher and higher in the all male dorm, it was like going underground. It was the scariest thing ever. So the way that and I think that's that's another sort of embodied kind of culture thing. There were some I had some thoughts about kind of the that sort of thing in the in reading the Paul stuff. Justin is saying in the chat that that we're moving maybe a little fast.
Yeah, I thought that before my life got interrupted, like with a normal work day, how was I going to try and keep up? But I was just going to do my best. But then a lot of life things happened, and I didn't get to read anything in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. How would people feel about, kind of resetting? Are we interested enough to kind of continue with these? And if we did them at a different pace?
I'm interested. I think they're fascinating, what I'm reading. The two together do seem, at least of what I've covered, I don't know, you guys can tell me if it comes more into alignment, but they're just like very different. So
they do seem to be very different. It does seem to be kind of a forced thing trying to connect it.
I was going to comment on the same thing. I think they're very different. And I read them separately anyway, but I don't think I would have chosen to read these synoptically. That's okay. I think it's good to try experiments, but I don't think this one is working for me either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I am sort of, because I'm a slow reader. I'm sort of struggling with both of them, which one to start and things like that. So to be honest, I'd rather prefer just the one book.
Okay.
At time.
Yeah. Tim, you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of things first. Checking that you can still hear me, because
yes.
I'm not sure about this. Right, okay. I think I agree. Having got 2-3 chapters into each of them, they're not an automatic pairing. I think there's enough overlap, though, that they make an interesting comparison. And there might well be a benefit when we get to the end in both, and possibly more importantly, get to the end of the discussion on both. Because I was reflecting earlier, which is partly why I piped up about the chaos that I see in the vault, is that partly because obviously the Sonkin book was very much about the tool and the method. We all seem to be a little bit more particular about using it cleanly and clearly. And I was trying to follow through with some catch-up reading on what we have been saying this earlier today. And I couldn't tell in many cases who'd written it, because we seem to have stopped putting our initials or our tag or our whatever we're calling it.
That's a good point.
And likewise, there seems to be instances where some people are going back and adding. They're not taking out their, not so much the previous version, but the draft almost, such that you have two notes written by the same hand, possibly, same title, almost same content, and it's going, okay, yeah, we're going to go left and we're going to go right.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about our Australian friends who have no ego positioning, should we say. And we seem to, have, for whatever reason, I'm not totally sure why, we seem to be making a mess of it in terms of the notes this time round.
Mm-hmm.
How we draw that back, or how we just try and be a little bit more particular. And there seems to be a lot of stuff in the root, as it were. There seems much more stuff just being dumped in the root,
Mm-hmm.
or therefore not in our own folders, says the person who's got an empty folder. But never mind.
Yeah. What if I think I can probably, I'll go on the community forum and I'll try to remind people to, because I have noticed that, and even in cases where people are putting things in their own folders, it is occasionally difficult, if I'm, if this is working correctly, right, and we're, and we're following links, right, and we're taking advantage of that capability of Obsidian, then we're going to end up in places that, where we don't, where if people haven't stuck their names on. I mean, I guess I can sort of, when I see that, that huge header, I can assume that that's Chris's work or something like that, but it would be helpful just to know. So I will make a point of asking people, reminding people to do that in the community.
So it was, it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't actually know, because I haven't played that far really. If you go back to the sort of the old Excel, when it was only one sheet, one tab per file, you had to be very careful about cross-linking them and not moving them too far. But providing it was in the same folder, the link maintained.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also grew such that if it was in a subfolder, by its relative position state put, the link maintained. Is the true same here? Is it here? Is it true the same?
It should, yeah. I mean, my experience with Obsidian is that unless you sort of recreate the the content in another folder, and there is a lot of us are doing that. Justin, you mentioned you made you captured 4,500 words of notes in your own vault, which I assume at some point you may take and take some of them, a subset of them, and stick them in your folder, right? Then and I've done that too. And what I find is that then if I've created links or I used to play play around a lot with, sort of creating these empty nodes that I would then go back and fill in. And so then those show up as kind of, even if I have filled them in my own vault, but that they weren't in a folder that, that I had excerpted and stuck in this vault, those will just show up as empty links. So yeah, there is, everything that's within this Dropbox folder ought to remain available to everybody, regardless of where we move it about, whether it begins in the root and then goes into a folder or a subfolder or whatever, if that's what you mean, Tim. I also played around with the idea of putting things in folders specifically so that then I could publish them out, right, to Obsidian Publish, right, because then only the stuff that was in that, if I opened that as a separate vault and then applied, and then published it from there, then I could sort of have my cake and eat it too. It would still be part of my own overall system, but it wouldn't be as difficult to kind of figure out what it was I wanted to publish it. Pat, the trick to my cranking out these videos is that I've got this book that's already done that I am reading from. So that's the easy thing. It is something, actually, that is something that has been attracting me a little bit more, I've got to say, than honestly, really the too much to know reading. When I've had a few moments in the last week or so, the question for me has been, do I want to scan another reel of microfilm, or do I want to read and make some notes on too much to know? And I've been probably guilty of going too much in the other direction. But another thing that we could do, and maybe I'll make maybe I'll ask, I'll take a poll in the community folder in the vault to see if, other people who aren't here, like Chris and Tracy, want to weigh in on it. We could we could basically unbundle these and say, well, okay, we'll read one or the other of them first, and actually, my gut instinct and would be to read Paul first, and then maybe read some of the articles that you thought were better than Paul, and compare them along, in some of those topic areas. How would people feel about that?
I feel like maybe I should admit in some ways what I did with the poll, which is that I skimmed it and decided that I wasn't gonna go into depth or put it in my vault, because I made a decision about the level of evidence that was presented, basically based on other reading. So that's kind of why I recommended those other things as places to start with some of this stuff.
Right, which suggested to me that you're in the topics, but just not in the way that she treated them. Is that accurate?
Kind of, I think this is what made it really difficult for me to even approach the idea of synoptic reading of these two books, because I'm fine with different fields. I love that stuff, but on the one hand, Anna and Blair's book is I'm just awed by it in terms of how it's written and how it presents the evidence, and the way that she weaves all of that together seems, and it seems like a super original topic as well, this idea that we can go back to the note taking in order to learn something about how, these Latin encyclopedias, that's the wrong word, were put together. Whereas and she's a professor of history, this is what she does, whereas Annie Murphy-Paul is a science journalist and she's interested in this stuff. But my problem in general is that there's a certain kind of, I think I said this in the first meeting, but there's a certain kind of book that I'm trying to read less. And unfortunately, Annie Murphy-Paul's is that kind of book and specifically it's books about psychology. I shouldn't equate that. Books about psychology or neuroscience written by people who are not working in those fields, because there is such a huge debate in meta science about those fields and about a lot of the evidence in those fields. So there are other reasons I didn't like it very much that I wrote down in my note, but one of the things I didn't write down was just like, if I go to a secondary source, so for science stuff, if I go to a secondary source, rather than the primary literature, I'm trying to get an expert view and I want context. And the trouble is, a lot of the context for psychology that we have is that there is a replication crisis, first of all. And then secondly, on top of that, it's not even clear that if you can get certain kinds of psychological studies to replicate in a psychology laboratory or what have you, whether those then generalize to be explanations for things that we know.
Yeah.
So
I wondered that about actually in the part where she's in the thing that we were kind of scheduled to talk about this week, that she's talking about kids on synchronized swings, right? And I was thinking, oh, that's so we've got all of these kind of studies. She's got this world of studies that have been done, right, that are available to her to kind of in maybe a Zettelkasten kind of way to sort of plug in these places in her argument. I was as I was reading that, I was thinking, okay, I need to know more about that. Is that kids whose swings are synchronized are more likely to be cooperative, but how much more likely? Is that statistically significant? Even so, do I even really care? So I think that kind of goes a little bit to what you're saying. But Justin, go. I don't want to delay you anymore. What did you want to throw in?
I would kind of like echo what you're saying, but maybe with a slightly different flavor. I definitely had, even though I've only finished 2 chapters, like I had kind of like a growing concern towards like cherry picking and replication of the things that are shown to us in the book, which I know is a kind of hobby horse I really got off of in Dawn of Everything as I became more convinced, but maybe I'm starting to climb back up on it for this text. Nonetheless, I did find the things that are presented, since we all have to figure out how to make our own life work for ourselves, I did find the kind of parade of options that people have considered useful for me to like consider some ideas that I haven't considered for myself in the past. So I kind of took it more as like not necessarily like really authoritative guidebook for what to do, but as simply like a buffet of options to consider. And in that regard, I still find it interesting and useful to be like, hey, could this work for me? I mean, I don't know if it's going to replicate across the entire population or if it only applies to like semi-drunk undergrads who happen to show up for psychology studies. So yeah, like totally all those things you're mentioning are totally valid and I agree with, but I still found it interesting for myself. So
yeah, I think there's kind of an interesting meta discussion that we could have about science communication too, because there have been a lot of best-selling books. Hi, Chris. There have been a lot of best-selling books that, Kahneman is the one that jumps to my mind, right? And then some other bestseller, Taleb will take and it'll channel some Kahneman. But it's, so it's sort of cherry picking the cherry picking. And at least Taleb sort of admits this is a personal essay. Right. This is not, this is me doing me, and it's not something that necessarily, everybody, that you want to take as some type of gospel. Although a lot of people don't read him that way, I think. So maybe that's another discussion. But okay. And Chris, to bring you up to speed, what we're discussing here at the moment really is kind of the idea of maybe slowing down and decoupling the 2 books and reading finishing the Paul book first, with maybe some additional content like the stuff that Anne has contributed to the vault, and maybe talk about some of those those ideas, and then move on to the Blair thing, and maybe extend this we don't, there's no reason that we have to have any type of hard cutoff for when we stop, with this particular club too. So we can do. And I guess maybe, since this isn't something that particularly interests you, would you be interested in doing that, or would you, kind of sit out and wait for the second half, or, how would you want to deal with that?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I find this stuff hard because, like, I don't feel like I don't know, Dan, because when we're doing Dawn of Everything, for example, it's like, oh yay, Dan, we're being led by a historian. Whereas like I really don't know anything about this stuff. Like I'm really just like feeling my way through it. But like I find the meta discussion interesting. Like that's like the meta discussion about Obsidian stuff is super interesting as well. Don't know. I would love to discuss Too Much to Know More though, but it's quite, I only have an e-copy, but it's quite a big book and it does have a lot of detail in it, so don't know. The thing is as well, like I am aware of this, like this is what happens though, and this is kind of the joy of learning, like everything snowballs, like it gathers moss and there's always more stuff to read. So I think I managed to recommend 4 things or something is what I'm trying to say as well, whereas we're already like there's too much to know.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is if it doesn't, yeah. And Chris just responded. Chris just said that in the chat. So is that part of the thing? Is that like this checks a couple of boxes for me, but not enough boxes for me to have made that choice of, okay, this, I've got an hour. I'm gonna, I'm not gonna scan that. I'm going to do this. So what do we want to do? I mean, is the actual issue here that we were trying to check, too many boxes, and there were a list of things, of sort of benefits, but unless you kind of reach a critical mass of them, it's not worth doing.
Maybe we can frame it another way to provoke a response from the community. Is anybody going to regret if we just stop reading both of these books as a group right now? Like, who is going to really feel bad about that? Like, I'll keep reading them myself. I don't necessarily feel like I need to continue participating in the group I want to continue participating in the group, but I don't need to do it with these books, and that would be fine. Like I would not feel bad about that. How do anybody else feel like they need to respond to that?
Well, that's an interesting point. So, and Pat did, sort of mention earlier in the chat, and I assume that it was kind of tongue in cheek, that that there might be other things that might be more interesting for us to talk about when we get together on a Saturday.
Could it be that we've got this book club and we're reading 2 books instead of 1? We're not actually, I mean, that's a lot of reading and processing, and maybe some of the interesting connecting of ideas in the vault has kind of been lost on the way, and that's part of the problem. Maybe we should just finish Paul and these other articles and try and like flesh out the vault a bit more.
Okay,
and that might generate more. Like be more interesting for what we want to get out of this club.
I would be willing to do that. I think that if I were focusing on Paul, I would probably get more out of it. And I think that there is some stuff there for me to get out of it. As you know, as was already said, I think that there are some things that are sort of brought to light and maybe not, sort of conclusively dealt with, right? But that are, that are sort of suggestive. And oftentimes when I read those popularization, kind of books, I do, and even in history, when I read, something like, 1491, I don't think, I don't think of it, it's a popular, or the Basques, Mark Kurlansky or Salt or Cod or something like that. I don't think of that as kind of the end of, and telling me everything that I need to know. Okay, Pat, now you're going to have to explain which one you really are in favor of.
I'm in favor of Blair better than Paul. As I said last time, I think that Paul was kind of esoteric for me. I just couldn't get into the extended mind and trying to tune into my body senses. I don't deny that there's an area there that exists. It just doesn't particularly interest me in trying to learn to extend that. Mm-hmm. But dealing with too much to know is a big concern for me, and finding it and using it to write and to do something that contributes to life before life ends. Mm-hmm. Those are my concerns. But still, the history of how people back in the 1500s have tried to deal with this and so forth is interesting, but not all that relevant to what my primary current interests are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So then I think my takeaway from this, what I'm getting from this, is that I will, in the community forum, I will ask people to sort of weigh in, and maybe what ends up happening is that, that the people, that we pick a time when we're going to do, Paul, and then we pick a time when we're going to do Blair, and, and people sort of self-select into, two little sub, groups of this. I think that there were some interesting things, and especially this chapter, there's some things that surprised me that were sort of counterintuitive, and I wouldn't mind kind of exploring, especially this whole groupthink thing in chapter 8, I think it was, right? I mean, which was really kind of the opposite of the way that I typically think of that, right? That she's sort of coming out in favor of, what to me, the image I get is, sort of the uniformed, phalanx of soldiers, kind of goose-stepping past the dear leader on the platform. And so that was sort of a challenge to me to kind of think of it the other way. Yeah. So that might be, I might be interested in, in kind of looking at those things and seeing, and getting people's reaction to that. Because it was, and she did bring together, and again, granting that we're not going to kind of assume that this is sort of conclusive. Yeah. So Justin, it's it was a chapter on groupthink that was really kind of arguing in favor of there being some type of, something that goes on, and maybe, pointing at some things that we might think about. It was kind of weird, she brought up, group mind and Jung's ideas of the collective unconscious, and other people's idea, speculations that maybe there's even something going on, some type of, mind-to-mind connection, which then she says, collapsed under its own imprecision and incoherence, which I thought was really funny. It was very, it was kind of very, very much out there. And not at all, and not really kind of, and maybe I need to read it more closely, or read, or I haven't really looked at sources or anything like that. But, so what about contagion theory? What about convergence? What about, emergent norm theories? I mean, there has been some, some kind of work done on this. So it might be interesting to look at. So
the story about the ship coming into port, I think it was in San Diego, loses steam power and still has momentum and loses communications, can't even warn the sailboat that they're about to run over them, was interesting. And the point was, well, all these people on the ship kind of worked together and somehow managed to avoid the collision and the catastrophe that it could occur. But then there's no real explanation of why and how this was achieved other than normal discipline.
Yeah, that this was an example of some type of extended mind in operation. It seemed like I mean, there were other flaws with the way the story was handled too. I mean, it's kind of interesting, the author was not at all interested in the cause of it, or sort of the resolution or how it was really resolved. So there are none of those details of the actual story that would have made it more appealing as a story too. So Tim suggested kind of ping-ponging back and forth, switching back and forth every other week from one to the other. That's another thing that we could do. Or, but if we've sort of determined that we're not really learning anything from comparing the two, well, that's the penultimate chapter. I think that's the last thing before the conclusion, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, so that's about as crazy as it gets, I think.
Maybe in the vaults, we could each summarize what particular thing, if any, we got out of these books so far.
Okay.
For applying to our own life.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah.
After a while of doing it now, and it's two books at the same time, my both reading and note-taking pace and thinking pace is, at least because it's two books and one is much denser than the other, I haven't had time to look into any extra sources outside of ones that I have already read and am still kind of processing, linking the two together. So I feel a big sense of overwhelm that we're doing two books at the same time. And I'm trying to draw parallels between the two, as well as to prior stuff we've been working on in the past, particularly, Sanka's book in more recent memory, because I think it's closer to some of what's going on here. But I've been reading in some sense to pull out some pedagogical ideas of how do we teach other people, how do we apply this. And I know there's a few other educators here, people who are education tangential. There's some fun ideas and she gives some examples, but there aren't always clear examples of how does one apply this or put this in.
Right.
Although I find in this week's sets of readings, we're now far enough into chunks of the books to start applying that. But I know personally, I'm way behind processing notes and getting them into the vault to play around with others, at least asynchronously. And I would suggest that there may be that same sense of overwhelm for others, because the speed and velocity of what I see in our shared vault is not what it has been for either of the past two books.
Right.
So I'm, I won't guarantee that that's how everyone else feels, but I'm guessing based on that signal of vault velocity, everyone else is overwhelmed as well.
Mhm.
Because
Yes.
it's hard to keep up. But
Right, I agree.
so
And
there's, but even
yeah.
in drawing that parallel to a broader discussion is the, you know, and particularly at the beginning of this week's reading in Paul, she talks about innovation versus imitation. And to some extent, we've all been using imitation of each other and how we take notes along the way, and how others like Luhmann or, you know, but in what I see to a great extent too, in the broader space beyond just us, of everyone using Rome Research or Obsidian or LogSec or these 50 other tools that are out there, everybody's all talking about it on social media, and they're all trying to reinvent the wheel. And I see almost no one looking closely at sources like Blair or any of the hardcore researchers and books like Forgetting Machines, or Manfred Eigen, I think, has a lot of stuff. You have to dig on the internet to find it, but he's got an old blog on note taking that has a huge amount of material. And I very rarely see anybody looking at those things. How do we imitate the people of the past who took notes as a better way of doing it ourselves? Instead, we're all looking at each other, trying to reinvent it and imitate each other in the moment to try and come up with a better process for ourselves. And I'm curious what people think about that, because to me, that is an idea that ties both of these books together this particular week, finally, in a very concrete way. And as well as how we've been looking at this and Sanka Aaron's, you know, going back, you know, 2 months now. And how does that affect what we're reading, how we're reading, the pace we're reading, and the overwhelm we're experiencing and facing, versus, you know, should we be innovating? Which, you know, I honestly, I don't think we should, but, or at least it's easier to innovate if you're an expert on what the history has to offer first, and then you can actually come up with some actual innovation there. So I don't know. And I think all those compound upon what do we do and where do we go from here is concrete, like solvable problems.
Yeah. Justin.
Yeah, I think you have a really good observation there, Chris. Like, obviously I can't comment on how overwhelmed I would be from just the books if the rest of my life had been normal for the last 3 weeks. But even before that, when I was looking at it, I was like 2 books at once, and they kind of have a lot of pages to get through in a week. And my week's usually pretty busy to begin with. Like, I don't know how I'm going to keep up with this, but we'll just try it. And I actually really like your second thread, Chris, about like, because I'm trying to focus more on my own processes. And maybe this goes to what you're, something it feels like you're trying to say, Pat, also. Focusing on those, like what note takers have done in the past as a way to like prime our own knowledge base for how we innovate or adapt or imitate for our own note taking. It feels like a richer source than this is, even though that wasn't necessarily the intent of these 2 books, or maybe too much to know it kind of was. But I don't know. It feels like that might be a little better direction to look at things that are explicitly about note taking, because I really do see the connection to Sanka's book to like some of the things we're mostly trying to do, it feels like, or at least I'm trying to do, which is to really figure out how to be more precise in my and usable in my note capture, rather than just kind of like, ooh, shiny magpie mind on everything, which is what I think I've been doing in the past and trying hard to not fall back into.
Yeah. And this, I think Chris, you're right. I've been feeling like a professor who has assigned too much reading and then doesn't even want to read it himself. So yeah, maybe that's an idea then. Justin and Pat maybe are making maybe a way forward is to read the Blair, look at the historical precedent, and then kind of come back to maybe Paul, but maybe Paul plus. And maybe because I'm, one of the reasons that I was attracted to the Paul book was because it was sort of connected in my mind with, retrieval practice and with things like Make It Stick, and other things, which some of them have, some of them are on that sort of bloody edge between popularizing and pedagogy. But Kate Jones is, she's written, actual sort of pedagogical stuff. I would say that, that Pima, has been more of a popularizer in the retrieval practice area. But I do think that is a thing that does interest me, is sort of the kind of turning the corner to, all right, because when that was one of the reasons I wanted to go back to Sonke Ahrens again as well, was, I'm trying to teach my students, in addition to how to actually write a term paper, how to prepare to write a term paper. And so, that, and then, and I have been thinking a lot about, these questions of, what is it, what are my actual, student learning objectives? Do I want them to know this, and that? Or do I want them to have some type of skill set at the end? Or do I want them? I was talking with a faculty member down at the university that we visited yesterday, and she said, and she was a professor of Kate Jones, retrieval practice. She's got a whole series of books. And then, I'll get you the other one too, that I've used as a source. And she was saying what she wanted to do was sort of change. She was an ethnic studies professor, and she was trying to build something in where she could assess a change of heart of her students, right? Because these are sort of mostly, Southern Minnesotan white middle class students, and thanks, Chris. And so that was kind of her goal. That was the most important thing to her. And she, and she said, well, I've got other things, I've got assessment, and I've got, in my syllabus and all this kind of stuff, but this is the thing that I'm most interested in. I said, well, okay, that's what we need to do then, is kind of, work together to kind of create some language and create some actual goals and figure out how to, to do this. And so I am kind of interested in, in that, turning that corner and figuring out what the next, what the thing that, that we want to have for ourselves, and that we want the people, the students or the family members or whoever we care about to, to have as, as ways of, sort of understanding the world, processing the information that comes to them, and then creating something with it. So I do think that probably the Paul book has a place in that, but maybe has a place as part of something else rather than kind of as a freestanding thing. So how do people feel? That was a long-winded way of saying, how do people feel about finishing the Blair book first? Okay. So we have a consensus here. I will. Then, and I think that's a strong enough consensus that what I will do, rather than a poll in the community thing, is I'll say that we got together. You can watch our video if you want, and this is the conversation we had, and this is what we'd like to do. And then people can comment on it if they have significant objections. So let me actually, while I'm in, I have another screen up here. The other that I was thinking of, it's not going to jump up at me in Amazon, so I'll just I'll open my Kindle really quickly. Kindle takes some time on the computer, doesn't it? Not a great interface for computers. Sort of like, what? You don't have an Amazon Kindle reader? How could you? So we're going to penalize you.
Curious if anybody else has had the experience that their reading pace in reading at least things that are deeper and denser like this that you want to pull material out of and reuse. If your reading pace has, been cut in half because of the, to some extent it's extra work and you're putting the work in up front, which I appreciate because a lot of this stuff is things I know I'm going to use in the future specifically versus other things I read for fun or just general broad information that I don't care that much about.
I guess I have a thing I could say because when I started the Blair book, I was completely overwhelmed because it is so detailed. But then I realized that her writing style meant that I could basically read it like Christopher Alexander. Do I mean Christopher Alexander? I think I do. He wrote A Timeless Way of Building. No.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
no mind.
And
Oh, right.
language. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. All right. You could keep talking and I'll go fetch the book because I can just show you. But I realized I could read it like that and I was like, yay. Basically, all that means is you can read the intro, then you read the conclusion, and then you read the first sentence of every paragraph, and you've basically read the book without getting dragged down into the evidence, because the way she writes is like claim evidence, or at least that's what I assumed she was doing. It seemed like what she was doing, so that really helped. And then so you can do like a quick read to like get the structure of the argument and the claim, and then you can like go back and read about all of the detail in the middle. That's what I do anyway.
That's how I tell my students to read like a grad student.
I have found a couple of times when I'm reading her, I'll come up with an idea or a question and I'll do a quick search of the entire text to find the thing. And there have been 2 times now, literally, where I've come up with questions, searched the text for references I know I have read other places and I expect she'll cover somewhere, and only to find literally on the next page or 2 pages later, she's actually talking about that exact same thing. And had I been a little more patient, she would get there. But it's like, oh, I need to know the answer to this question now. And does she cover it, or how can I search through 3 other books to find the answer? Mm-hmm. But that's been kind of a weird, quirky thing. And I think to some extent, because I've read Aaron's and 4 or 5 other historical sources that touch on some of these topics, that I find myself being impatient and literally like, oh, here a page away, she's talking about this other bizarre ancient source no one else has heard of. Well,
at least that validates her a little bit that she's found that ancient source.
Yeah.
So
or even I think, and she talks about it, or Paul talks about it at the beginning of this week's stuff on kind of it was before the groupthink stuff. I think it was in the innovation versus imitation. She talks about the ancients, and she doesn't get into who they were, but the Aristotles and the Quintilians, it very much was. And I almost expected her to use the word bees and, hovering around and pollinating flowers, which was the metaphor that was used in almost all the ancient sources. And in fact, it was so common in the ancient sources that I have actually seen books and texts and old manuscripts where someone has written the word apes, apes, which is the Latin word for bees, in the margin as they were reading.
Mhm.
So they're literally thinking about okay, how do I steal this idea for myself and then rebuild it into some argument I want to make? And the marginal note they've made is literally just the word bees with no other context. And if you don't know that that exists as a form of, okay, this is something I'm going to imitate and blatantly steal. And in most ancient sources, it literally was so common, no one thought about actually citing the original because there was, generally so little to read to begin with. Everybody read all the same books.
Right.
So you knew what those sources were. And particularly if it was the Bible, you could mention 2 or 3 words and people would know exactly which book where in the Bible. You didn't need to reference it line and number the way we would now. But that kind of sense of imitation and, how do you copy and then carry forward, which we totally lost. So to me, that the way Paul kind of tied that together to say, now we're in this era of total innovation, which to some extent I would say is massively failing us as a society. Where you run too far ahead, or if in the big classic example I guess we could point at now is Mark Zuckerberg's fail rapidly, move fast and break things, I guess is his quote.
Right.
And how do these information practices actually impact us as a society at a very deep level? We've gone from imitate the best and improve upon it as best you can to then that shift in the romantic period of, there's all this stuff that's been said before. How do we say new stuff and be more creative and interesting? And, now here we are 200 years after the romantic period. The question is, how do we combine the best of both worlds? How do we imitate, but quietly and slowly innovate to actually actively make things better instead of, run roughshod over what we all know we know?
Well, and in history, there has been this sort of, the pendulum swung so far away from, writing syntheses, right? Writing synthetic texts that, aside from, the occasional people who do write textbooks, that's just not done anymore. And the assumption was that this is, okay, see you later, Justin. Thanks for coming. We'll, so I'll summarize this to some extent in the community forum, and then we'll go forward. Cool, thanks. So the idea that that wasn't, that to do a synthesis was to sort of impose some type of a master narrative, and then after the cultural turn, of course, that wasn't acceptable anymore. So there's, but there are some things that are shared, and so how do we? That's why this idea of encyclopedias and kind of pulling these things in and it being less important to sort of cite the original source than to have it in the encyclopedic work are kind of interesting.
Or even in a modern context, and it's to some extent I have found myself not caring so much, but I used to be I'll use the word culture whore, and consumed a huge amount of both popular reading and television and what are now essentially memes. But there's a meme culture that people use online to communicate. And if you don't know the memes, which a lot of people don't, you get kind of lost in the shuffle. But the idea that, a simple picture can have a massive aggregation of material and information built into it is, in fact, I've seen this week alone, here's a good example, the word stan. I'm a note-taking stan, as an example. How many people here know what the word stan means in that context? Anybody? I mean, it's a weird, to me, I've seen it a couple times, and it's a reference to
this is Eminem.
Yeah, it's an Eminem
And
reference
Dido.
to a song he sang, about a stalker fan. So Stan becomes a portmanteau of stalker and fan. But in internet culture, that means something. And I've now, in this week alone, I think I've seen the word Stan in 2 news headlines.
Wow.
I have a feeling the vast majority of people who see that word don't think about it, have no idea what it means. If they think it's I asked my wife, and she said, "Oh, that's a typo. Like, how did the editor miss that? Like, it's fan is what he's trying to say, right?" Because she read the headline and then the 2 paragraphs, and she's like, "Oh, they misspelled fan." But to a group of people, it means something, and something very specific. But if the meme hasn't spread far enough as information, are you actually really communicating the thing you think you're communicating?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think Torrin's got a point. In just a heart, a cultural heartbeat previously, right? It was the stands, right? All of the stands, during the breakup of the Soviet Union, when all of the stands were, becoming their own little things and places and stuff.
But does our communication outstrip us in terms of how fast the culture is moving, particularly in a place where everybody on the planet has some sort of free publishing platform, in social media in particular? Does it move fast? Are we, and then are we overwhelming ourselves with, I look at most of social media and it's too much to not know, because it's so short, and so it's bite-sized and it's fun, and you can scroll for days, but have you actually learned anything at the end of the day?
Right. So actually, Chris, there was one of the things that I was thinking about regarding that sort of cognitive apprenticeship thing. You wrote you sort of did a summary in Hypothesis, I noticed, of and I was thinking, oh, this is like a permanent note. Was that in your mind as you were doing that, as you're kind of summarizing those 4 elements of the cognitive apprenticeship thing?
Yeah. So in my setup, that's what I would consider more permanent notes. Usually I think of as things that are my ideas that are inspired by the writing, and that I work on and hone and create. Whereas that particular one, I think, was more of a summary or synopsis in my own words. So to me, that's more of a literature note.
Okay.
But that's the kind of thing that I expect in some of the things I'm thinking about, especially for teaching and, pedagogical purposes. Eventually I'm going to write something on a topic where I'll use that. So I've rephrased it all in my own sense. And I also bookmarked the original paper because I want to read, I think it was Seeley Brown and a couple others who I've read bits and pieces of, but I don't think I've read that particular study. So I'm both bookmarking it to go read that original paper, because I in some sense, I also find that those ideas had to have predated them by several decades.
Sure.
So where's the source of that, and track that down. But I'm also writing it as a literature note for a Zettel, so I can just literally pick it back up 6 months from now and dump those 2 paragraphs into something else.
Okay.
But I'm also, in some sense, you'll notice I think there were 1 or 2 words where she uses or they, yeah, she used the word scaffolding
Mhm.
based on them. And I think I use the word knowledge scaffolding as a more specific subtopic that ties into something I'm, working on.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I'm rephrasing it and trying to actively link it to 3 other things that I know are in my note setup that you can't see at the moment.
Right.
So that's a little bit of what's going on as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, those notes have been,
because that's the kind of,
go ahead.
that in fact, that's actually a good example of exactly this thing is, the group and the cognitive setup that she's talking about there is how do we as a group, how can I mentor others in understanding what my note was for and why and how with that. And you can't do it except by speaking through it. You can look at it. You, Dan, can look at it and say, I think he's doing this here. And here's an example of this thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I thought it was a good example. And I thought it was also a good example of, sort of the meeting the requirements that you need, as you were saying, that, you want to go back to it 6 months later without having to read the context that, that it came from, and read what's on both sides of the quote to understand what it was again. So kind of sort of going back to this whole process thing, the atomicity of it, the paraphrased, translated nature of it. I think we're all really, we're all kind of go right into this conversation that we're having on both of these texts right now.
I think and part of it's the overwhelm of doing 2 books at once, but I've also started taking to what I consider to be a bad practice of I'll highlight a sentence or an idea or a fact, and I'll come back to it later to do the rephrasing because I can do it based on that one sentence without the context around it necessarily, versus other ideas like that I think that idea to me is more important. So I'll take the time out to write it out in full to make sure I understand it, but also because I can do the work now while I'm looking at it of making it the thing I want to be able to reuse later. And sometimes I'll throw in hypothesis, I'll say, link this to these 3 ideas. And I may sketch out what those ideas are because I know I have notes on them.
Right.
To make it easier to remember what I want to, when I saw it, I want to link it to these ideas, but I don't actually have to do the work of finding them, tracking them down, and doing the link right now.
Right. Yeah. I've sort of taken to double bracketing things in hypothesis because I know that Readwise is going to sweep them into the vault.
But then sometime this week, I have to find some time to sit down and actually create those tacit links. And I won't have to recreate quite as much context because I'll know what those are.
Right.
Well, a lot of times I'll use the tags that I put on in hypothesis, and I'll do a quick search of all those tags in my vault to see do any things pop up at a top level that are also cards that I need to link to that thing so that I can pull them out later and create a structure around them to write a paper or an article or a book or chapter or whatever it is I'm going to work on. Yeah.
I don't know who contributed the thing, the linked and unlinked mentions at the bottom of the page thing, but I've been finding that very useful because once I do actually put the keyword in either in hypothesis when I'm taking notes or in Readwise when I'm doing my my daily review, sometimes I go in and I make a note there and stick a keyword in, and then I can find it, then it just jumps up in that linked mentions section at the bottom of the page when I'm reviewing. What I do need to do is I need to build in more time for reviewing. That's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, to me, that's the bigger part of and I'm getting to a point now, having done some of this and refining a process for a year or two, that I'm starting to see some fun, interesting, and quirky insights building up in the system that I know I'll be able to both find and use in writing something later on. But it's the benefit too is it's stuff that I know I actively want to write something, and so I can work on 10 different writing projects at the same time, which I never could before. It was, oh, I need to work and focus on writing this one thing and finishing it.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you get bored, or something else happens and you get sidetracked, and then going back to that thing is painful as all get out. But having this kind of new way of looking at, and having looked at other people's old commonplace books and Zettelkasten and other examples of this, has made it a whole lot easier for me now to actually do this process and do it in a way that's a little more fun and intuitive now that I know it exists. Versus, there are other things, and a lot of the highlight stuff is not stuff I necessarily will reuse later, but I might put it into, so in my notebook I have, or Obsidian vaults, I have a Zettelkasten space for things I know I'm going to actively reuse. But then I also have like a wiki sort of space for accumulating bits of knowledge that I may reuse later on, but more likely I'm not. It's just, it's an interesting thing to know and review over.
Yeah.
And I actively separate those two spaces just with a handful of different folders, because, and one is more, in my mind, more important to me than the other. But I get the impression from what I watch on, in what I would call, I guess, the general productivity porn space on Twitter and social media, almost no one else is doing that. They're just throwing it into a big pile in hopes that some magic will happen. I've seen enough examples now, both historically and even contemporaneously, that I know the magic is not going to happen unless you put in the work somewhere. So I try to front load as much of the work as I can, but it also means when you're reading two dense books like this, that you got to read a lot slower.
Yeah. I think it's, I have a bunch of, it's kind of weird. I have a bunch of stuff in my vault that is, that I had, and initially I had sort of, I had hashtagged it all output, right? Because it was stuff that was going into lectures or going into, an OER textbook, right? So it's in some sense, it's kind of like it's very, trivial stuff. It's, the details of, Genghis Khan or Eric the Red, or, people who I mention, right? And so it's not, so there isn't a lot of, kind of like originality there. It's not a concept that I'm struggling with, or it's not an idea that I'm developing or something like that. It's just something that, I teach, when I talk to students about this, this unit, of my course, I'm gonna talk about these people. And so there's a ton of stuff in there. And that's been one of the challenges for me, has been sort of figuring out how to value that at all, really, but also, kind of hold it in a different, in a different place, and think about it differently, think about these facts differently from, from arguments or from interpretations or from, kind of more, what I think of as kind of more complex ideas. That's been, that's been kind of an interesting thing as I've tried to develop this. Okay, Tim is saying the atomicness and supporting context rather depends on your current expertise. Yeah, larger bytes need to be quoted and paraphrased. Yeah, I think that and facts need to be, facts need to have sources and citations and things, as well as arguments and interpretations and original contributions and things like that. Yeah, so there's Yeah, and there is kind of a trap, a collector trap too, right? That but there are yeah, I guess, and I'm sort of in the side panel here. I'm also looking at what we had originally talked about as doing in this kind of 5-week format. We're almost sort of anyway done with Paul, and so what if we sort of reset and said that that rather than read a new section of Blair for next week, that we sort of kind of take a moment, take a week, and kind of recapitulate. Do we want to just kind of say to everybody, because one of the other reasons that maybe there's only a half a dozen of us here is that people haven't been able to kind of keep up and haven't felt like they wanted to come in and and just listen. I can listen at at 2x on YouTube rather than sitting through 90 minutes. So what do you think? Should we try to take a week to kind of recapitulate these 3 chapters, or should we back up a little bit and look at and give everybody a chance to look at them in more depth?
Is that like a sort of catch up and work on the vault week?
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like it, or at least how you say it, Dan, or when you say we're almost done with Paul, I feel like I'm almost done with reading Paul, but I'm not done with consuming and processing and synopsizing and
Right.
finishing my notes on Paul. I'm nowhere near it. It's going to be another 2 or 3 weeks probably to finish that process up.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm done with reading the main part of the text, but the actual processing and the digesting. I've consumed Paul. It's not digested yet.
Right.
I guess is the way to say it.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it.
So having some time to finish that digestion process and throw some notes in the vault and see what happens thereafter, because I don't see there's not as much conversation and back and forth in the vault as there has been in past groups. Mm-hmm. Where I think I've gotten a lot more out of the books because of what others have said and their viewpoints and perspectives that I didn't bring to the book for myself.
Right.
So I've actually gotten way more out of this because of what's happened either in our conversations here or through the week in the vault. And in fact, I've gotten into the habit where every day or two, I'll open the vault and look at the change log to see what's happened, to see what someone else has gotten out of it or been getting out of it. And that, I'm starting to get out of that habit because there's not that much has changed. Or I don't see the change because either that or because you haven't logged in and updated it in a day or two. So
yes, both of those actually this week, both of those things, right? I went in and I updated it and, and I turned the changelog on, and then I went and I put the announcement of the meeting in the community forum. And then when I came back to the changelog to see, then there was just, it was just like half a dozen things that had populated from the week. So yes. So okay. So then what's the thing to plan for next week? Do we try to digest Paul? Or do we, maybe that might be a thing to do. Try to digest Paul, work on the vault, and then continue, and then maybe take another, week and try to digest what we've done with Blair up to this point.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
All right.
And I think Paul, is a little easier a text to move through because she's synopsizing a lot of
Mhm.
and then doing more popularization of what's out there in the research literature, which to me is a little easier than going through Blair, which is quite a bit denser.
Yep.
I don't know if other people feel the same way, but and because I think or
I
at least
actually feel oppositely. Like that's one of the reasons because with Blair, it's like as previously described, like the structure is the same throughout the book. I think it's beautiful. Whereas with If End in Mind, like it's like scene setter, and then it's like stuff, maybe, and then I'm like, but does this relate back to the scene setter? I can't tell anymore. So I really lost my way in it, and it's kind of why one of the reasons, among other things.
Okay, so
Anyway.
so then next week, again, I'll ask again because I think we have two responses that I heard from it. Do we want to take a week, digest Paul, update the kind of catch up in the vault, and then take another week and we would meet, right, to discuss the things, the progress that we've made on that, kind of next week we would meet again and say, okay, now we've got this stuff, stuff's been happening in the vault. People have been digesting Paul, and then use and then in the next week do the same thing with Blair. Say, okay, now we're going to catch up on these 3 big chapters of Blair, and and write, and start to process that, write notes about that, and have that in the vault.
The other benefit of doing that too, I think, in part because Blair is a little denser, is those who don't care as much about Paul can also use that time
to take a week off
either take a week off and do more Blair for later.
Yep.
And then we can clear the decks of the one thing that there is, at least for me, there's less to process in Paul than there is in Blair.
I think
I will catch up and get to the end of the whole enterprise faster, finishing Paul and then doing Blair.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And selfishly for me, at that point, my semester will be over. Although I am teaching a summer course, so maybe I shouldn't make any assumptions about what my summer is going to look like. But I'm only teaching one summer course. Yeah, I think that would work for me. If that
does that help, Anne, if we get Paul out of the way, just to get her out of the way for you?
That's okay. I won't come because
yeah. Okay,
I haven't read it closely enough.
So you have an extra week to kind of focus on Blair, and then at the end of April we'll see you again, and we'll be on our way. All right.
Although we'll miss you desperately.
Yes. Yeah, but it won't be. I mean, we did miss you when you weren't in the other group.
That's okay. I feel like something that we don't talk about enough in like note taking, what have you, is like one of the fastest, or like too much information. It's like you can decide not to read things. You can decide not to read things, or you can skim stuff, make a very short note, and come back to it later. Anyway, I used to be an editor for a very long time, so I used to read like 70k words a day sometimes. So there are ways of dealing with this stuff. It's okay.
Coming from the agenting world where you read screenplays, you read the first 10 pages, the last 10 pages, and then you tell the writer, oh, how great all the middle was without having read any of it at all. So
right. Yeah. Or you did. I listened to an audiobook, what was it called? The Story Grid or something like that, a while back, which was and they did a very close reading of Silence of the Lambs, I think, and applied the grid to it, and it was it was interesting, I guess, in its way. Now I'm on their mailing list, and they're like trying to sell me screenplay writing.
It's an industry.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Then I think we've got a way forward. So thank you for your patience. This has been obviously a learning experience for me.
Well, and it's a good live example of too much to know.
Yeah, I like the graphics. That was the thing that attracted me to it, Tim, was that was that graphic on the front cover. I thought, oh, this looks very complicated, but interesting. Yeah. Okay. So so we have used our time. So that I will write a next thing that will happen is I'll write kind of a message to the group that says, you know, this is what we're going to do, and so we'll process Paul first, and then we'll return and really, you know, give Blair what we owe her. All right. Oh, thanks for the link, Chris. Yeah.
Are you, I haven't looked lately. Are you putting chat logs into?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So thanks for doing that. So yeah. All right, then we'll have more content to talk about next week and less process. All right. And we'll miss you, but we'll see you in the following week, in a fortnight. All right. Thanks very much.
I probably won't be here next week then, because I haven't gone into Paul yet. Into that one yet.
Okay.
So I'll carry on with Blair.
Okay. Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
I hope you have a good Easter.
Thank you. Thank you. You too. Take care.
Bye.